Good morning, everyone. This is Trudy Coxe. I'm the director of the Preservation Society of Newport County, and it's great to be back on WADK with Bruce. And our guest this morning is just fantastic. Our guest today is an author, a professor, and a lecturer, Cecelia Tichi. Cecelia is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She is an award-winning author and faculty member at Vanderbilt University, where she is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of English and American Studies, Emerita. And she is also the past president of the American Studies Association. And she is the winner of the J.B. Hubbell Medal for Lifetime Achievement in American Literature. So we really have a fantastic guest. Cecilia's books span American and cultural activities from the colonial days to modern times. She has focused on the Gilded Age, and that's what we want to talk about today. She has written books about Jack London. She has written books about 7 activists from that tumultuous era, the Gilded Age, and one memorably titled book called What Would Mrs. Astor Do? A Complete Guide to the Manners and Mores of the Gilded Age. And today we are going to be discussing with Cecelia, Dr. Tichi, Gilded Age Cocktails, History, Lore, and Recipes from America's Golden Age. That is a book. You can get that book on the book stands of the Newport Mansion store. And we wanted to interview Cecelia because the Newport Mansion's Wine and Food Festival is fast approaching, and it just seems like a perfect topic. So welcome, Cecelia. Sorry about that long interview, but you've got a great resume, which I wanted to share with our audience this morning.
All right. Well, if anybody is still awake after that, let's talk about these cocktails.
Yes, let's do it.
Yes.
Would you tell us a little bit how you first became interested in the Gilded Age era? It's a part of history that certainly has gained some notoriety in the last months because of the TV show, The Gilded Age, written by the famous Julian Fellows. But I'm so pleased that you are interested, and we want to hear how that happened.
Well, let me say first that in the classroom, we look at the writers of that period: Jack London, Edith Wharton, Willa Cather, and of course, Mark Twain, who gave the name to the era, the Gilded Age, in a novel that he co-authored in 1873, The Gilded Age. It's not a very good novel, I have to say, but it's got the ingredients of the age, the entrepreneurship, the good fellowship, the conniving lobbyists. There are villains and heroines, men and women, populating that novel. But we might also remember that those same decades, roughly the end of the War of Secession, the Civil War, right up through until World War I. So roughly from the 1870s into the 1910s. And that is an age that was also called the age of steel and steam and the age of enterprise. And so the authors drew me to the era. And then we start to see these wonderful occurrences, a great age of invention. Here was Edison with electrification and others. What people don't realize is that the cocktail was also an invention. Just as people were bicycling all over the streets and lanes of the United States and territories, so were people for the first time drinking liquors and gins that were now iced and flavored with fruits and garnishes. And prior to the time of the Gilded Age, we'll call it, prior to that time, any additive in a whiskey drink was considered befouling, weakening, diluting. And so the very first sort of call it a beachfront toward cocktail culture was ice. And no one knows who first put a few chunks of good hard cold ice into whiskey, let it chime against the side of the glass, let it cool that distillation, and it tasted good. Now, the word cocktail itself, that word, has been traced back to the 1700s here and there. It does not have to do with roosters, which is what people would mostly think. It's an interesting story. The cocking is the cutting of a horse's tail to indicate that it is not a thoroughbred, not a purebred. So to distinguish the pure, and there would be the whiskey, undiluted, from the, in some way, mongrelized drink, a horse's tail was cut. It was called cocked. It was a cocktailed horse. And so when these drinks began to be complemented with additives, at first cocktail might have been a kind of negative term. Is this drink cocktailed? What have you done to me, barman? But then it became the signature name for a wide variety of these drinks. And let's say that just as Edison promoted electrification, so did some well-known bartenders, but particularly the founding father, a man named Jerry Thomas, born in Hartford, Connecticut. His parents hoped that he would be drawn to the ministry, but his ministry was the bar. And he tended bar both on the East Coast in New York City and in San Francisco, a bit in St. Louis, and in London as well. And he started mixing these drinks. And his first book had 10 cocktails, and they were really basic. A little ice, maybe a little vermouth in your gin, and there you go.
Can I interrupt you for a minute, please? Because
please.
What were the drinks prior to the cocktail being invented? What were people drinking in the Gilded Age before, so that we can see the transition?
Trudy, thank you for that question. The brown liquors, of course, bourbon, rye, Scotch whiskey, straight. Now, it's sometimes said
was beer, wine, gin,
and beer goes back to the colonial days, when that substituted for water, because water was dodgy. It might make you sick, but once you had a brewery make beer, whatever made you sick was killed. And it was notable that Benjamin Franklin would not drink beer. He preferred water and was considered eccentric for that preference. So beer all along, and the brown whiskeys and gin, of course. And so,
and just to understand the culture a little bit, were they people who didn't drink until 6 o'clock at night? Were there cocktail parties, or what they would call gatherings where people would meet? Did women drink like men? What was the quantity of drinking that occurred?
Deep, interesting question. From the accounts, the memoirs, the fiction, we learn that men would drink together. For women, for the ladies, and I'm setting aside those who were addicted, and the addiction runs through. From the Puritan days, there was a pamphlet by one of the Mather divines titled "Woe to Drunkards." And Nathaniel Hawthorne, in one of his novels, denounced liquor. And of course, Edgar Allan Poe was held up to American society as an example of the depravity of dissipation and a warning to all. So, and here came this stage play, 10 nights in a bar room, all in favor of temperance. But meantime, men in fellowship are drinking whiskey. Ladies, no whiskey. For ladies, wines and punch. Now, as we know, punch can give a punch, but lightweight wines with perhaps fruit, strained fruit, and there was a lady of the 1860s, Mrs. Sherwood, whose book on etiquette included a section on punch for ladies and warned that American ladies are unaccustomed to drinking very much alcohol, so that they should drink lightly. Now, all along, champagne was highly favored. And by the Gilded Age, both men and women were drinking a lot of it, especially in the affluent and wealthy classes. Beer remained a staple, and a shot and a beer in the bars near the factory towns. As you noted, I'm from Pittsburgh. Those steel mill workers, the shift is done and right to the saloon for a shot and a beer. The beer was the chaser. And so it went in Chicago, and so it went in all the towns of heavy industry. So there was, in a sense, a class distinction. Who was drinking these fancy cocktails? The Waldorf Bar, managed by Mr. George Bolt, the men's cafe at that bar. Those were Wall Streeters, or those were the high-flying buccaneers from the Montana copper mines, who were not the workers in the mines, but the owners, who were reaping vast fortunes. And they would go to New York, and they would go to what they called Bolt's Bar. And maybe they would see Buffalo Bill Cody there because he frequented that bar. So we have a long history, many, many decades from the colonial times, of beer, of wine. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose poem, The Village Blacksmith, exalted the virtues of work, that smithy works day and night, all except for church on Sundays. But in another of his verses, Longfellow rhymed catawba and wine, and so we see the thread. But by the Gilded Age, there was a fairly strict stratification of who drank what. And the cocktails became the drinks of the affluent.
And why did the cocktail emerge at all? Just innovation.
Innovation. And if we think the Gilded Age, there was so much innovation. I mentioned the bicycle. We've all seen that the cycles with those enormous one wheel and then one tiny little wheel.
Yeah.
And there are some people who are still up on them and going down the street to the amazement of onlookers. But a French blacksmith invented the coaster brake, and that was the start of sort of bicycle frenzy. There were bicycling magazines, monthlies. So here were bicycles, here was electrification. So we had the Great White Way on Broadway and arc lights. And along with this, why not try these new drinks? We're trying new ways of life.
Yeah.
And there it was. Let's try it.
Wow. So, and did you say that Bolt himself was an inventor or not?
No, George Bolt, B-O-L-D-T, was shall I call him, a great guru of hotel and bar management. He had managed the Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia and was brought up to manage the Waldorf Hotel and the Astoria. And then, of course, with both of them combined, he managed the hotel and he managed the food and beverage service, hiring the managers there it was Bolt who had the idea um, of setting up a ticker tape in the Waldorf Astoria bar with the idea that when Wall Street closed, those Wall Streeters weren't finished with their high-flying bets. He installed the ticker tape on a long bar, and at one end of it had a brass bull installed,
Oh
and
my
at the other end a bear, and in the middle a little lamb. And so take your chances. So Wall Street closes. All the hustlers are on their way to Bolt's bar. They're quaffing, and they're quaffing some cocktails faster than they probably ought to have, and they're wagering on stocks at the same time. And George Bolt was a brilliant manager of beverage services in those New York famed hotels that everybody who came to New York, who was a gentleman, there were rooms for ladies, there was a tea room, there was the palm room, um, gentlemen only in the bar room. And so, if I may say a word about ladies, the ladies, were they
Yes. Yeah.
well, officially, no lady would be seen, let's say, at a hotel dining room quaffing a cocktail. Where might she have drunk? In a private home, for example. In Newport, Pembroke and Sarah Jones from Wilmington, North Carolina, very wealthy.
This is keeping up with the Joneses. Jones.
Exactly so, exactly so. And they invited their friends, including Elizabeth and Harry Lair, to visit in Wilmington. Elizabeth records mint juleps served in the Jones home, and her husband saying that after a few sips, he became, quote, strangely gay, unquote. Meaning there. All right, we won't go there. So private homes, of course. In addition, Colonel Mann, publisher and editor-in-chief of Town Topics, that scandalous, nearly actionable legally weekly, that had a section called Sauntering, full of the latest gossip. He would charter a private rail car on weekends and take his editorial staff, wives, girlfriends, up to the Finger Lakes, and his daughter was the bartender. And we can see her with swizzle sticks and mixers and cocktail shakers and those bottles, because at 9 a.m., Colonel Mann would start rousting everyone, calling out, "Say, ducks, ain't you dry?" And it was his daughter, grown-up daughter, who mixed the drinks. Now, there's a third place where ladies might, in public, imbibe on the sly. In New York, in a confectionery, and perhaps in Newport as well. You would have to know, you of the Preservation Society. A lady would order officially tea, and what would be served in the teacup would be a cocktail. In New York City, this was probably Maillard's Confectionery, well-known place where an exhausted shopping lady might sit down, enjoy a dainty sandwich. If she ordered that special tea, the drink would be mixed for her in a nearby bar room, brought across probably an alley where coal was itself delivered. We still see some of those coal scuttle, openings in alleyways, and it would be delivered through the back of the confectionery and served to her in a dainty cup, and perhaps with her friends. So we know there was imbibing. I was sorry not to find among the co-eds of the, no, not co-eds, the young ladies of the Seven Sisters schools, perhaps a diary entry about a libation served by a gentleman for the weekend, the Yale weekend or the Harvard game. Nope, could not find it. So as far as I know, private parties, a tea room in a confectionery that might, with a wink and a nod, and then if you could get on that private Pullman car to Colonel Mann's weekend, his daughter would mix for you your favorites.
And what was the view of women who were discovered to be drinking more than they should? Were they ousted from society? Were they frowned upon and gossiped about? What was the reaction?
Trudy, a good question. Let's remember, for one thing, that the medicines taken in great quantities by the ladies, such as Lydia Pinkham's tonic for good health, they were laced with alcohol. Bitters, which we mostly know for dashes in cocktails, a little orange in the old fashioned, Peychaud's in the Sazerac from New Orleans. Bitters was an apothecary dispensed health aid, 50% alcohol.
Wow.
So already women were, shall we say, soused without having to acknowledge it or thinking that what they were drinking, it made them feel different. Surely it was for their health. But a woman who, until the 1920s flappers, when there really was a revolution along with prohibition, until then, a woman, not a lady, but a woman staggering on the street, redolent of alcohol, was a slut, ought to be more or less kicked to the curb in today's phrasing. So it was among the upper classes. Let's bear in mind, ladies had escorts. Any lady who might have had a bit too much of a liqueur, because after dinner, ladies did enjoy those thimble-sized glasses of liqueurs. That was fine. Let's say the lady had had champagne, perhaps before and during dinner, claret, perhaps, with the different courses of the meal, and then liqueur, perhaps creme de menthe, all the cremes, and were she a bit unsteady on her feet, she would be escorted by footmen, by the butler, if not by her own gentleman, and then from the door to the coachman, who would assist her into the carriage, and then back to her residence. Once again, assisted every step of the way, bevy of servants ready to help keep her on her feet. And there would be no need to bruit it about that any such thing had perhaps been a bit too much for Mrs. or Miss. So it was kept quiet all kinds of ways.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, you need to tell us a little bit about some of well, first of all, you talk about the Gilded Age as being the golden age of cocktails. That, I guess, is because it's when the cocktail was invented. Is that right? Is that why you?
I think, yes, Trudy, I think that's a fair statement, an accurate statement. Back to Jerry Thomas, the patriarch of the cocktails. His first book had those 10 cocktails. Well, later, he published a book whose subtitle was The Bon Vivant's Companion, 135 cocktails. Among them, the drinks we know today, the martini is there, the old fashioned is there, and the proportions over the years have evolved. It's useful to remember that the Gilded Age cocktail imbibers had something of a sweet tooth. And
Mhm.
they were able to because really for the first time, sugar was widely available from the Caribbean, from Hawaii. And from Hawaii, it came cane sugar under very favorable trade terms. If we rewind back to the colonial period, sugar was in loaves, sugar loaf, as some ski mountains are called, the
Mhm.
sugar loaf, and it was kept under lock and key because of scarcity. Antique stores will sometimes display a sugar safe, it was called, with the lock, with the key. And so it went. Suddenly here was sugar in the Gilded Age, lots of it. Sweet drinks were favored. If we look at the recipe in my Gilded Age, I'm going to hold up my
Yes,
copy.
please do. It's a great
All right.
book.
Gilded Age Cocktails, and they're beautifully published, I have to say. New York University Press, hats off to them. I'm thrilled with their production values. But if we look at the recipes, and there's a little note in here in the preface that our ancestors had a craving for a sweet, for instance, in the martini, that no longer pleases. Dry martinis today with so little even of vermouth, or perhaps a dirty martini with some olive juice in it, but not so much sugar. So the drinks, the standard drinks established by Jerry Thomas and his colleagues at the bar, same names, recipes evolving even to this day.
Now you said that he started out with 10 significant cocktails.
Mhm.
What were those 10, or what some examples of the 10?
Bourbon cocktail. So you get bourbon and you get ice and maybe you get a cherry. End of
Oh,
it.
okay.
Gin cocktail. Gin. And Italian vermouth or French vermouth, a little bit. Ice, period.
Now that's a drink that doesn't exist any longer, I don't think, does it?
No, I don't think so. But the idea of gin with ice and a little bit of something else. Same thing, Scotch, rye. I mean, it's as if he went right down the liquor cabinet, bottle by bottle, each one able to make a cocktail. I should mention that a special invention by Jerry Thomas is a cocktail that I was able to use in my new mystery crime series fiction set in the Gilded Age. You never get the girl out of the Gilded Age. Here's the drink. It is called the Blue Blazer. Here's what it is, and Jerry Thomas invented it, and he made it for a gold miner prospector who came into the bar on a wintry night and said he wanted something that would send fire down to his gizzard. Here's what Thomas did: 2 silver mugs with handles that don't transmit the heat. All right. In one mug, hot water, a little sugar, and a little lemon juice. In the other mug, Scotch whiskey. Okay. Set the Scotch whiskey alight and begin pouring from one mug to the other. This arc of blue flame, dazzling. The prospector loved it, and the Blue Blazer got itself into Jerry Thomas's second book. I asked a bartender, "Did you ever make one?" He said, "Once." And I told the story. So I used that drink as the flirtation device for my Knickerbocker gentleman who's in the West with his parents who have become financially anemic and need their fortune resupplied. And their young son, they have feared, is addicted to alcohol. Absolutely not. He's just learned to make cocktails. And in this Silver Dollar Saloon, Virginia City, Nevada, he sees the young gentleman, the silver heiress, Valentine Louise Mackle, going to be rich beyond belief when her daddy passes away. And she is based on John Mackey, who was a silver king from that era. Well, the young man, Roddy, goes to the bar, gets his two tankards, the sugar water hot, the scotch, and he blue blazes and they fall in love. And that's how those two meet.
Wow.
And then I bring the couple, they marry to New York and to Newport. And in the first novel set in Newport, it's the summer of 1898. And these newlyweds are called upon to solve a mystery, starting with a poisoning at Mrs. Astor's ball last winter in New York, and a good friend imperiled in Newport this summer. What stalker, poisoner lurks in the social world of the houses in Newport, the cottages? So and I was off for my mystery series. So
Wow.
now I'm writing mysteries.
Now tell us the names of some of those. That first mystery book is called what?
A Gilded Death.
Okay.
All right. That's the summer of 1898. Then Roderick and Val go back to their chateau on Fifth Avenue for the fall, only to find that there have been murders in Central Park, practically across the street. And we have new title, Murder, Murder, Murder in Gilded Central Park. This is the Val and Roddy DeVere Gilded series. Then comes winter. They're at the opera in their private box in the Diamond Horseshoe. And in the next box, oh my goodness, what's that seeping under the carpet from the next box? Ta-da! Who has died there? And what are the stakes? And so we have a fatal gilded high note, and that's the winter. Then comes the newest book, just out just this past week.
Good for you. Great.
And I'm typing away. I mean, this is the Gilded Age. Once it gets its hooks into you, you are hooked.
Yeah.
A deadly gilded free fall. I'm sorry, a deadly
gilded free fall.
And in this one, the DeVeres are beckoned to Chicago, and there are several chapters in Chicago. I say that Chicagoans might not like this portrait of their city in the Gilded Age, in which it is the fact that their mayor, Carter Harrison, opened his front door one night and was shot dead by a dissatisfied office seeker who thought he surely was owed a job in the Carter Harrison administration. Bang. But we find Mrs. Joseph Bowen, and this is true. These novels are based on real people and real events. Mrs. Bowen, a banker's wife, highly educated and a civic-minded person, supporter of Jane Addams's Hull House, an advocate for juvenile courts, a bomb on her front porch. The night watchman took it away. It was exploded underwater. This is from her memoir. If she had lifted the lid, a life would have been lost.
Yeah.
So they're in Chicago, and I'm working on another one. So again, so four of them out and available now. A Gilded Death, Murder, Murder, Murder in Gilded Central Park, Um, um,
A fatal gilded high note.
yes, and a deadly gilded free fall.
Wow.
Woo. Yes, yes.
I have to ask you, have you yourself ever made or had a blue blazer?
No, I have not been able to persuade anyone to, consider it. You have got to have perfect aim.
Yeah.
That mug, a waterfall of blazing, blue blazing, really hot. It's alcohol burning off. Now, the most I can do in a cooktop skillet, something that has to have, say, brandy or cognac, set a match to it and jiggle the at a distance, jiggle until the flame dies down. That's my limit. No, but I haven't been able to persuade anybody to
Wow,
do.
that would be something to accomplish, I think. And
Tell
you
you
could
what, Trudy, I'll come up to
travel around the country showing off.
I'll come up to Newport and let's go out and see if we can get somebody to mix us a blue blazer.
I'm on. That would be fantastic. And or else I'd like to try it myself. Cecelia, when did we go then from the straight line bourbon, water, vermouth, whatever, to the really fancy drinks that people seem to be attracted to today? The pink
Well,
labels and all.
well, by the early 1900s, we had, for instance, Thomas Bullock, an African American bartender in the Pendennis Club in Louisville, Kentucky, his Louisville. He was mixing his juleps and other drinks for the gentlemen of Louisville.
Yeah.
Then he mixed those drinks for the gentlemen in the St. Louis Club, and then on to San Francisco. All the large cities had bartenders who were experimenting. And in fact, the warnings began to be for caution. You think you've invented something new and wonderful. Look at the available bar books. By 1904, there were bar books. Let me recount just a few of them. The Flowing Bowl, and it's available on reprint. A very hefty compendium of for bartenders too. Here's what you must do: shine up your glasses, arrange your fruit attractively in pyramids. Never be idle, this sort of thing, 1 to 10. So all the cities, Oakland, California, the Saddle Rock Club, Jack London and his wife enjoyed dining there. And he could have cocktails, she would have wine. So it became a national libation celebration. Let's remember that
And may I interrupt you? Were cocktails being imbibed in Great Britain and France, or was this an American thing?
Yes, they were. In England, it was the Edwardian period. In France, the Belle Epoque. And yes, and international, a kind of confluence of cocktail. Yes. And here in this great, huge continent of the New World, I'm setting aside Mexico and Canada here, just the United States and its territories. By I think 1890s, there were 90,000 miles of railroad track. That meant that the transit of the goodies, all of the ingredients could be conveyed, and so could the messages. And here were the nationally the press associations that could publish some recipes. If there was a favorite Christmas cocktail published in, let's say, the New York World or Herald, well, it would appear in Boise within a few days. So it really became a nationally known and and depending on one's social class and depending upon one's income, how much extra money did you have for, let's say, a bottle of orange bitters? When you had to put bread on the table, did you have that disposable income? The middle class was also a class much expanded by the Middle Age, even when we count in that the 1890s were years of severe recession from about 94 to 97, some hard times there. Nonetheless, the managerial class expanding, white collar jobs expanding, and a segment of the public with more leisure time for
So it
reading.
sounds like it was a national craze. And if you wanted to keep up with the Joneses and you were middle class and you were having fancy people over to your house, you would rush out and find a cocktail or two to serve in order to impress.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was your obligation as a host and hostess for the evening.
Now
Lest
tell
you
me,
be- yeah.
you said somewhere that Commodore Vanderbilt, if this bringing it back to Newport,
Right.
was he a drinker? I think I know the answer, but was Commodore Vanderbilt a drinker?
Commodore Vanderbilt, not so much.
Way much earlier.
Yes,
But
much
he did
earlier.
have
No.
drinks.
I'm trying to think. Commodore Vanderbilt, no, not Cornelius, the founding father, but Gordon Bennett was also, James Gordon Bennett Jr. was also a kind of Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, and having built the casino in Newport, he was quite an imbiber. Gordon Bennett, from youth in New York, he was a bad boy.
Yes, he's known in Newport well.
And he was called Commodore also. And it was brought to my attention that Admiral George Dewey, of Spanish-American War fame, the Battle of Manila, he was also to some called Commodore. But I think that the drinks in my book, there are two Commodore drinks. There's also a Dewey drink, Dewey cocktail. Those are, I believe, cocktails that honored the patriarch Cornelius Vanderbilt's achievement in shipping in rail near monopoly, the New York Central Railroad.
Yeah.
All rail lines to the Mississippi, from the East Coast to the Mississippi. So he deserved and got two cocktails with quite different recipes, and they're both here in the book.
Well, my aspiration, unfortunately, we could talk for another 43 minutes, I think. My aspiration is to hold some sort of an event sometime next summer in which we feature some of the Vanderbilt drinks from your book. You are a fantastic guest. And boy, I have learned more about cocktails than I ever thought one could learn. So I thank you so much for being with us today. And the book is a great book. The cocktail book is a great book. And it is for sale in the Newport Mansion stores. And of course, you can find it elsewhere. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's beautifully published as well, Cecelia. So I thank everyone for listening. And I thank you very much for entertaining and teaching us so well. This has been a wonderful morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. Your questions are tough and terrific.
Thank you. We will again chat in the future.
Deal.